audio by Raising Free People Network.
I'm Akilah S. grief literacy educator, longtime podcaster, here to explore what we lose individually and collectively when we fail to name grief as part of our everyday life. Grief isn't just about death, it's about endings, expired relationships, outgrown roles, identities and dreams we released. If we tend to grief in its diversity, we can expand our capacity to navigate change, to hold space for each other, and to move with more presence in a rapidly shifting world. This is What I Let Die podcast, where we move from grief struck to grief tending. What happens when we stop avoiding grief? Let's find out together. Hey, you. Welcome to What I Let Die podcast, a space for us to talk about grief, endings, and what we make possible when we stop pretending that grief isn't running the show. I am Akilah S. grief literacy educator, longtime podcaster, and someone who is so committed and called to learn to listen to grief instead of trying to outrun it. And today, I want us to talk about what we were never taught about grief, because let's be real, most of us grew up with this bullshit idea about what grief is, how it works, and who deserves to feel it and when we deserve to feel it. So let's unlearn some of that together. What is grief, really? Let's start by paying attention to and questioning some of the myths. I'd say most of us were handed this tiny boxed up definition of grief. It looks something like, grief is what happens when someone dies. Grief is just sadness. Grief has stages, and once you move through them, you're good. Time heals all wounds. Lies, all of them. Let's start with what grief actually is. Grief is the natural response to loss, any loss. It's not even just a human response, but for the purposes of our process, let's zoom in on grief being a natural human response to loss, to any loss. And I like to say grief is how we savor loss. It's how we slow into it and pay attention to our feelings and experiences with what we lost. And grief is not just sadness. It's frustration. It's numbness. It's confusion, exhaustion, even relief. And it's not just about death. Grief shows up whenever something ends. Grief shows up whenever something changes. Grief shows up whenever something is taken from us. And if we think about it, it means you can grieve a relationship that didn't end with a death, but it ended nonetheless. You can grieve a version of yourself that you no longer are. You can grieve a dream that no longer fits, or a dream you are really clear now just ain't gonna happen. You can grieve a career path, a friendship, a sense of safety, a belief system. If it mattered, if it shaped you in any way, if you had to let it go, grief will come. Let's talk about the many faces of grief. I'll share some of the types of grief with you and then invite you to think about where your life and experiences have brought these types of grief into your space. Anticipatory grief. This is grief before the loss even happens. So watching a loved one decline can bring on anticipatory grief, knowing that a relationship is ending, feeling something unravel, even if it hasn't quite hit yet. These are some examples of where you might have anticipatory grief. And then there's disenfranchised grief, the grief that people shame you for having, the breakup that wasn't that serious, quote unquote, the pet that you lost that others don't consider a real reason to actually grieve, only to just be sad, the job you left that people say, at least you had other options, a type of relationship that ended that wasn't a healthy relationship, but you grieve it anyway. The mother or father or friend or family member of someone who committed a crime, did something harmful, and they themselves are being punished, and we feel for them. Those are examples of disenfranchised grief. And here's the thing with that. Just because other people don't recognize your grief, don't make it any less real. That's important. The grief is real because you are experiencing it, and other people's recognition of it is not how we determine or identify grief. There's also cumulative grief. That's a type of grief that piles upon other types of grief before you've had time to process. So a sudden loss can reactivate old grief that you never tended to. I want you to really think about an example of that in your life. So it might be that you lose a loved one, they die, but you were already struggling with another major life transition, like starting college or ending college or dropping out of it. When I think about intergenerational aspects of grief. So for me, being raised partially by my grandmother and her being in a stage of a type of mental decline, while at the same time, my daughters are moving into adulthood and shifting out of certain needs and into certain others. So much grief tied in with so much joy, tied in with so much curiosity. So I'm having the cumulative grief, anticipatory grief in relation to my grandmother. Cumulative. Sometimes you'll hear them referred to as grief stacks. And if we don't make space for it, it shows up in ways that we do not expect. It shows up and bleeds over into other experiences. This is why we're having these conversations, so that you can be able to name and tend to what is happening in your world. There is identity grief. This is grieving who we used to be or who we thought we would be. As a longtime unschooler, I've worked with a lot of families, including my own, around identity grief. The version of you before a major life change, thinking that since you were organized and people listened to you and your work here, that when you become a parent or the parent of a teen, then you'll be able to apply those skills to this. And then when that don't happen, you are moving through a type of identity grief because you saw yourself as a certain type of person with a particular set of skills. And those skills are just not skilling in certain spaces. And you are experiencing identity grief. Identity grief can be around expectations you had for your body, for your career, for your relationships. The unlearning process brings on a major, major experience with identity grief, grieving the beliefs and identities that you once held, especially things like leaving behind religion or cultural norms or old ways of thinking. As we move through this socio-political climate, I'm seeing a lot of folks experiencing identity grief because of what they thought government was for or what was possible with a certain type of government, and seeing themselves as part of that. I voted for this. I believe in this. And now I am seeing this. And this matters, this identity grief, because it often goes unspoken, because we assume we should just move on and embrace the new thing. But even good change can carry grief. And we need to be so aware of that. There's also collective grief, the grief that we hold as a community, a culture, a society. Sometimes we call that collective mourning. Grieving violence, injustice, systemic harm. What is happening right now to people in Gaza, as we are witnessing also what is happening in the Sudan, the Congo, Haiti. I mean, so many spaces are bringing us into awareness of collective grief as we gather to resist, to speak up, to demand, to cry, to wail. The loss of cultural traditions, languages, or ways of being that we lost because of colonization and the ongoing impact of that, forced assimilation, displacement. These are experiences we have with collective grief, the weight of the global crises, climate change, pandemics, the various wars. Collective grief is so very present right now. It's heavy, it's ongoing, and many of us are carrying it without even realizing it. And so naming it can help us see that it is just not something that we alone are holding. We're actually holding it together. And for some reason, that feeling can often offer us a type of relief. There's also ambiguous grief. This is grief without clear containers, clear closure. This is where there is loss, but it's not like a clean-cut loss. A loved one with dementia, Alzheimer's, they're alive, they're here, but they're not the same. A relationship where someone is emotionally unavailable. You feel the absence even though they are still around. A missing person, an estranged family member, a friend you've lost touch with. These are examples of ambiguous grief. There's not a clearly defined thing that happened. The waters are muddy and different. And ambiguous grief is tricky because it doesn't come with like rituals or acceptable ways to mourn it, because it didn't happen just so, but it's still real. It still needs tending. It still needs naming. In the next episode, we're going to zoom in on a particular type of grief that is about grief beyond death. And some of it we've touched on already, but I am dedicating an entire episode to non-body death grief because it matters just as much. All the types of grief matter. And the knowledge of that, the wisdom of recognizing that all types of grief matter, is what allows us to move from being grief struck to actively tending our grief. And what does it even, because you know what happens when we don't tend to the grief? Well, I'm going to start with what doesn't happen. It doesn't disappear. It does not disappear. What happens is it settles. It settles in our bodies. It settles in our relationships. It settles in our picker, what we use to pick and choose the things we do. So our picker can be broken by grief, which affects our bodies, our choices, our relationships. Avoided grief makes us act out. It makes us shut down. It makes us numb, detached, or stuck in patterns that do not serve us. But when we learn to recognize grief, to name it, and to begin to tend to it, that's when we start to move differently. Not because it makes the grief go away, but because we stop fighting it. That is the shift from grief struck to grief tending. And in these episodes, that's what we're going to get all up in. How to identify as a grief tender and how to move into skill as a grief tender. This is what we're exploring here on What I Let Die. Not just grief itself, but the ways we meet it, the ways we avoid it, and what becomes possible when we stop running, when we stop holding our breath. So I want you to think about something. What's something you've grieved that no one acknowledged as grief? That is my invitation to you this episode. What is something that you have grieved that no one acknowledged as grief? Sit with that. Maybe write about it or talk about it with someone you trust, because this conversation is just getting started.
This episode is part of a multi-episode series that serves as a public, free grief literacy project called What I Let Die podcast. The show is co-produced by Akilah S. Richards and Kate Umstatter Thompson. Show art by Chris Richards. Much of the content comes from or is inspired by Akilah's Grief Tenders course called the Eyelid Course, an acronym for I Let It Die. Show notes and resources are available at radicalselfie.org/wild. Share the show with friends and be sure to rate the show wherever you listen to it.
Audio by Raising Free People Network.